O my Lord and my hope, help thou thy loved ones to be steadfast in thy mighty covenant, to remain faithful to thy mighty manifest cause, and to carry out the commandments thou didst set down for them in thy book of splendors, that they may become banners of guidance and lamps of the company above, well springs of thine infinite wisdom, and stars that lead aright, as they shine down from the supernal sky. Verily, thou art the invincible, the almighty, the all-powerful.
Thank you, thank you, Peter. So here we are. I had to go and do a lot of deep thinking and to see what would I do. Did we run out of stories to tell? I figured there are about 10 million Baha'is in the world, so I guess if we tell stories about each one of them, we'll be here for a couple of centuries at least. So I figured let's choose somebody that we all know, or we know a little bit, or like to know more. And since we've been talking about, of course, we're still in the early period, talking about Abdul Baha and talking about Akka, we mentioned Thomas Breakwell, we mentioned slightly Lua Getzinger. So what did I come up with this week? I guess you probably guessed, but you probably didn't guess.
Thomas Breakwell?
No.
Lua Getzinger?
No, not this time.
Juliet Thompson.
Correct.
What?
Oh, really? All right.
Juliet Thompson is one of my favorite people. And I read her diary in printed form. But then I was looking for the book and I couldn't find the book. I looked all over the place. And when I was in Washington visiting friends, and it's a long story. I think Shekufe Nashababadi took me to the Northern Virginia Baha'i Center. And I was looking for the book and there was no book to be had. And then I think they dug up one, they went upstairs and they went through, I don't know, some boxes or something. And I finally got the book anyway. So I have my book. So what you're gonna do today, I'm not gonna be very creative, but we are going to hear a sort of a biography full of stories told by two different people, two eminent Baha'is. So obviously I wasn't there, I didn't know her. So I'm going to rely on two wonderful people that tell her story. And it's just a wonderful story. Now, we're not going to talk so much about the diary this time. We're going to talk about what they say about her life. So the first one is going to be from Marcia Gale, one of the most famous Baha'i authors, who knew her. So that's the first part of this evening. And the second part is going to be the same story told differently by another major figure who apparently right now has held firesides in Ireland for a long time, and that's Ozzy Whitehead. And in some early Baha'is of the West, he has an amazing chapter on Juliet Thompson. Now, not the same ingredients, not the same parts of the stories, not the same things, but more or less the same story, but it's told differently. So you're going to get double for the price of one. You're going to get her story from different angles. If you don't mind, I'll start with Marcia Gale. So it's funny, in the story, Marcia Gale mentions a visit to New York to her house by Robert Gulick. So I always like to put in dimes worth. Robert Gulick was family to me. He was an amazing Baha'i, married to my father's cousin. They were pioneering, of course, in Libya, and he was the dean of admissions and registrar of a Thunderbird School for International Management in Arizona. And she was my legal guardian, so I lived with them for a while in Arizona when I first came to the States. So Robert Gulick is a figure I know. So it's always good to know somebody in the stories you read that that sort of gives you my age. So let me start reading and try to read as slowly as I can. If you don't understand, or if I go too fast, just raise your hand or send a complaint to our producer here.
That's me.
So, what's your name? Marcia Gale mentions all kinds of people in the stories, and I had to look them up because I didn't know who they were. So anyway, you're going to hear of Enrico Caruso and the brother-in-law of Einstein, but they were all like close to Marcia Gale. So if I sit back here, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
You don't have to be glued to the TV.
No.
So whether or not General Tom Thumb, Barnum's midget, and at the start of his career, 25 inches long, weighing in at 15 pounds. So whether or not General Tom Thumb ever owned the greenish village, Brownstone, where Juliet and Daisy was Margaret Pumpelly Smith, where they lived so many years, we do not know. We don't. At the time when we knew the place, Daisy was renting it from Romain Benjamin, brother of Dorothy Benjamin, who married Enrico Caruso. Caruso was the most famous opera singer in Italy, and she was kind of an amazing person. Anyway, so that's the story with the house where they lived in New York. So all these names, all these connections. So like its fellows in the row, it was narrow and high with black railings to either side of the front steps, or other steps leading down to a long basement room and a strip of garden in back. Inside, up from the front hall, narrow stairs hug the wall on your right. The old house, painted light blue when we last saw it, long after the inmates loved by us were gone, might well have been the wealthy midgets, as Juliet was inclined to believe. It was just such a place. When Daisy asked Abdul Baha how to live, he said, "Be kind to everyone." The house was a haven for a motley crowd. Here, Daisy's brother, Raphael, told me he had once, during the Depression, left his bed briefly in the night and returned to find a sailor in it, complete with live parrot. Here, at one given time, in an upstairs room, Dmitry Marianov was Einstein's former son-in-law, who had become a Baha'i, who was writing a book on Tahirih, while Juliet was revising her I, Mary Magdalene, on the lower floor, and I, at ground level, refuging from the family apartment uptown, was finishing Persia and the Victorians. Yes, Susie. Here, Daisy, like Juliet, a fine artist, sat among their many guests, the firesides, usually inaccessibly vague. Daisy would, from time to time, utter a great truth. Once, when her cat unsheathed its claws and raked delicate upholstery, Daisy spoke. "Cats are more fun than furniture," she said. Abdul Baha had been all over the house. His living presence had blessed it all. In a dark corner of Juliet's whispering old studio stood a fragile armchair of black oak. It would later be willed by her to Vincent Pleasant, surprisingly small, with a cord across it, none ever to sit in it again. The chair of Abdul Baha. He loved her studio room. He said it was eclectic, part Oriental, part Occidental, and that he would like to build a similar one. Here, Juliet had read in manuscript the books of her friend and neighbor, Khalil Gibran. Here, she had struggled with her love for Percy Grant. Here, by my time, Marcia Gale says, We talked a little about the land of Cherokee, which, such is my memory of it, Lincoln had helped her father, Ambrose White Thompson, his close friend, to acquire. A rich tract of land in northern Panama it was, and Juliet believed that somewhere in Colombia, which then owned the area, a government building had burned down, and all the relevant documents about the property had gone up in flames. After her father's death, Juliet and her mother were poor. Susie. After her father's death, Juliet and her mother were poor. Juliet could, of course, have married money. Many men sought, as they used to say, her hand. Two prominent Baha'is who proposed to her were John Bosch and Roy Wilhelm. Come to that, Mason, Admiral Remy's son, whom Abdul Baha wished her to marry, was not a poor man. Juliet told me in those days, Mason had grown a red beard. And as they sat together, he would talk of the children they would have. And Juliet would visualize floating in the air about her, the Remy babies, each with a small red beard. Mostly, we discussed the progress of lack or lack thereof of our Baha'i community in New York and the nation at large. And one day, we decided that our faith most needed in America was the qualities of George Townsend. Immediately, we determined to cable the Guardian and ask him to send us George Townsend, a preeminent Baha'i who was the former canon of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin and archdeacon of Clonfert, to travel nationwide and teach. Far from ignoring our doubtless brash suggestion, the Guardian at once replied with a radiogram received 1948. I quote, Juliet Marzia, 48 West 10th Street, New York. Regret Townsend's efforts, Dublin vitally needed, 6-year plan, love, Shoki. Can you close Violetta's room, please? J'entends le bruit de Violetta. Let's close the door. Excuse me, we have interference with my daughter's room. So, Abdul Baha teaches that we must never belittle the thought of another. And although Shoki Effendi was carrying the whole Baha'i world on his back, he did not belittle ours, and he took the time to answer. Once, when the powers that be were making life difficult for me in another city, Juliet wrote them a letter in my favor. To this, there was no reply. What status did Juliet have? She was only one, the master said, that future queens would envy. Only one would be remembered long after the rest of us were gone and forgotten. She was always a rebel. She did not hesitate to speak well of the Germans during World War I and to exhibit the Kaiser's picture on her living room table, something like setting up a statue of Herod in a cathedral at the time. In later years, she decided to rewrite Mary Magdalene and make Judas a certain leading individual who afterward lived on to receive great honors in our faith. Juliet was a Celt from a long line of early bards, and she was kin to Edward Fitzgerald of the Rubaiyat. Her Irishness did not apparently extend to that country's religion. She told me that when her father was dying, he was by chance in the hands of the nuns, and they moved about, seeing to it that extreme unction, as it was then called, was duly administered, while her non-Catholic mother wrung her hands, reassuring the moribund, raised his head and said, never mind, Celeste, it doesn't amount to a damn. Rebels are valuable, but they are not always right. Once, contrary to everyone's advice, Juliet's strong feelings about an individual led her to and Daisy astray. She made us all come to the man's talks, or rather talk, which was always about love. We got so we hated love. No wonder he advocates love, was Harold Gale's comment. Look what's done for him. It had certainly given him Juliet and Daisy, and only later on did they see the light being that this man, his main interest seemed to be Daisy's bank account. As The Guardian once commented, our world order is founded on justice, not love. Our governing institutions are houses of justice, not love. The man did bring many to hear about love at Juliet's, which used to remind me of Romain Benjamin's gloomy prophecy that the ceilings would fall in. It was the unconventional rebel quality in Juliet, this plus her sympathy and true love, that attracted so many to her, particularly the young. All ages, sexes, skin colors, and degrees of wealth and servitude used to foregather at 48 West 10th. Her name was incidentally in the New York Social Register, along with her brothers. But I'm only there as a junior, she laughed. This unconventional quality of hers, frightening to any establishment, appealed to The Guardian, as it had to the master before him. We remember writing to The Guardian once about a town where the activity was barely detectable, and he replied that the situation was due to the, I quote, the lethargy and conservatism of certain elements in the community. Abdu'l-Baha praised Juliet repeatedly for her absolute truthfulness. On her second pilgrimage, when the Guardian asked her, "Do you like the Wilmette Temple?" she answered, "No, it looks like a wedding cake." She added, relaying the conversation to me. "We used to call it Mrs. True's church." Mrs. Corinne True, later hand of the faith, was known as the mother of the temple. She said Mason Remy withdrew his design in favor of Louis Bourgeois, although each received the same number of votes. Needless to add, the ethereal, lacy, floating house of worship at Wilmette does not look like a wedding cake, but Juliet had an opinion and she voiced it. Let us remember, the text says, that at the very root of the cause lies the principle of the undoubted right of the individual to self-expression, his freedom to declare his conscience and set forth his views. Baha'i Administration, page 54. We read in her diary the masters telling Juliet a thing so wonderful that she could not repeat it. In after years, she confided to Baha'i pioneer Bill Smits what that thing was. I quote, "You're nearer to me than anyone here," Abdu'l-Baha had said, "because you have told me the truth." Asked what he meant by here, she said, "Oh, New York, the United States, I don't know." So this diary we have here, which is, we're not going to read anything of it today, we're just reading about her. This diary is not the original longhand one. She destroyed that one. She was essentially a private person, and all those secrets have blown away. This diary is the core of the original. She kept whatever she wanted posterity to have, sat up in bed with the portable on her knees, and typed it herself. I was one of necessarily few to receive a carbon, and mine has some of her own handwritten notes in the margin. Some years afterward, I had the carbon professionally typed for the National Spiritual Assembly, but years later, it could not be discovered in their files. Also, but where the material is, we do not know. Still, more years later, when Harold and I were back from Europe and living in New Hampshire, I became aware that with so few copies in the world, forever, and consulting with fellow had brought out a handsome booklet printed by the Rock Crofters, East Aurora, New York, entitled Abdu'l-Baha's First Days in America, from the diary of Juliet Thompson. It bears no date or copyright. Certified she received priceless opportunities and proved adequate to her good fortune. Love is not blind, it is guided. But I like in Mary Magdalene because she loved and saw so much. She had that same storied love that Mary had, that love which, after all, is the only thing that holds the Baha'is together, or for that matter, holds the Lord to his creatures, or keeps the stars in their courses. She says here that one early morning, on that breathless, ecstatic, tear-drenched pilgrimage, she gave up her will, made over her desires and her life to the will of God, and saw how, when we are able to do that, the design takes perfect shape. Then peace comes, she says, and beauty and dreamed of blossoms upon our days. Again, she tells how the Master once gathered the American pilgrims together, they being symbols of awe, and said he hoped that a great and ever-growing love would be established among them. He knew that their one main desire was to live in his presence, and he told them how this could be done. The more he said, you love one another, the nearer you get to me. I go away from this world, but love stays always. Juliet's death, it's not finished. This is just part of, we're half through this introduction. Juliet's death, noticed in the New York Times, says that she was born in New York, but the jacket to her book, I, Mary Magdalene, undoubtedly more to be trusted as her a Virginian by birth and brought up in Washington, D.C. She was a cult figure. People became possessive about her, regarded her as theirs, and only grudgingly doled her out. This was particularly true of Helen James, who came from the Caribbean area and was a long-time companion. I can remember Helen angrily barring the door to me one day when Juliet was sick. It did not bother me too much. I knew from mythology that dragons guard treasures. Then there was another time when I had prevailed on a man to come over to the village all the way from Brooklyn and record Juliet's voice as she read from her diary. On wire it was. The business was new then. And Helen tried in the midst of it to break in from the other room and let in even more noise besides what was already being reproduced from the traffic on West 10th. You can say for Helen that she was a true friend to Juliet and faithful. One midday, years after all this, as Juliet lay in her bed, it seems that she looked up at Helen and asked, do you want to come with me and be with Abdul Baha? No, Helen told her, I'm not ready yet. And then, as she watched, she saw Juliet die. It was December 4th, 1956. They had moved by then, the Times said, to 129 East 10th. I was glad that she did not die at number 48. The Guardian's cable received by Daisy Smith on December 7th said, deeply grieved and her reward assured. To the NSA, he cabled, deplore loss, and he directed that a memorial gathering be held for her house of worship. This cable, among other praises, he referred to her imperishable memory, said that she was fired with consuming devotion, the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant, and called her much loved, greatly admired, outstanding, exemplary handmaid, Abdul Baha. So, 48 West 10th Street was a house dedicated to Abdul Baha. Often, when you were let in the front door, you heard his voice, the recorded spontaneous chant made in 1912, loudly reverberating through the rooms. One day, Juliet took Robert Gulick and we entered and me up the street to the corner of Fifth Avenue and we entered the beautiful Church of the Ascension that had once been Percy Grant's pride before his ruin. And she showed us exactly where Abdul Baha stood, delivering his first American public address on April 14th, 1912. He came out of the vestry on the right, just as the choir burst into Jesus Lives. He sat in the bishop's chair, which broke the 19th canon of the church, for the unbaptized may not go behind the chancel rail. The red plush chair with its high back was still there, just as it had been that other day, although no flame burned on the altar then. When he spoke, as you looked past the low steps of the altar, he was on the right, and he stood on the fifth flagstone. Abdu'l-Baha told Juliet she must either break with Percy Grant or marry him. She had broken with him. Percy had arranged this meeting for the master as a peace offering to Juliet. From this very pulpit, to win Juliet away from her faith, he had often inveighed against the decadent East, had even denounced the Baha'i sect, but today he had filled the church with lilies and arranged for one from the East and head of the Baha'is to speak. Juliet said that she used in her story of Mary Magdalene, whom, as Abdu'l-Baha remarked in the diary, she even physically resembled, many things she learned from the master himself. This book has inclined many a heart toward our faith, and Stanwood Cobb considered it one of the most graphic and lofty delineations of Christ ever made in literature. She illustrated her story with portraits, 3 of them, one hallowed of the master's face. Mary wears Juliet's face, they being lookalikes, and the handsome lover, Novatus, wears the face of Percy Grant. She was a serious artist, frequently exhibited, and a member of the National Arts Club. She had studied at the Corcoran Art School, then at Juliet's in Paris, and with Kenneth Hayes Miller in New York. During the Coolidge era, Juliet's beauty and social background, along with her artistic gifts, carried her into the White House. It is interesting to note how many Baha'is have been received at the White House, all the way from Ali Quli Khan and Florence and Laura Barney in the early days to moderns like Robert Hayden and Dizzy Gillespie. Juliet was there to make a portrait of Mrs. Coolidge, incidentally, one of the most popular of first ladies. The president came in to watch, said Juliet, chewing on an apple, and I told Mrs. Coolidge I could not put up with that. The portrait she did of Abdu'l-Baha described here in the diary no longer exists except in a photograph. Time damaged, it had to be restored, and Juliet felt the original was gone forever. The Kinneys maintained that he did not like it because he said it made him look old. Abdu'l-Baha greatly encouraged her art and told her it was the same as worship, but toward the end, she no longer cared to go on with it, nor even cared for her once loved New York as it had become, and all that she wanted to do was teach the faith. Sometimes, Juliet and Marjorie would recline at the top of Juliet's large bed, while Daisy and I would sit on chairs at the foot. The sooty, warm spring air would blow in from the little back garden, down where Rebecca, a statue picked up by Romain Benjamin, stood scanning the horizon, endlessly waiting on her pedestal, left hand to brow. It was one such a time when the conversation centered on Percy Grant, that dramatic preacher, when our view certainly merits a biographer, not only for his small role in our faith, but because he represents so much of New York's history at the century's turn. Poor Julie. How long did you love him, I asked. 17 years, darn it. In those days, it went without saying that the love was platonic. And that is how, reinforced by Marjorie, Juliet told me how things turned out for Percy Grant. Significantly, his end is relegated in the diary to a footnote. The story of it goes like that. Grant was, as Abdu'l-Baha remarked to Ali Quli Khan, comparing the popular society clergyman to his disadvantage with the fine Unitarian minister, Howard Ives, a womanizer. Here Abdu'l-Baha used a graphic Persian word. His remark was prompted by the fact that as they were leaving the church by a side door, they accidentally encountered the rector with a woman in his embrace. Later, the master, father to daughter, even more graphically, but in other words, warned Juliet to the same effect. And in the long run, it is of note that finally, a woman toppled Grant down. She was a Cuban descended beauty of great wealth. His luxurious car would be seen outside Grant's rectory by day and night. She had a dead white face with bright red painted lips and was given to wearing evening gowns which did not hide the fact one breast had been completely removed, while the other remained without flaw. No intellectual, she was what Marjorie called eruditized by association with famous artists and scholars. Wherever Percy Grant went, she went, gazing up at him as he towered over her and calling him Little Rector. Without his knowledge, she spent $60,000 redoing his house. When she had their engagement announced in the Paris Herald, his only comment for the press was no comment. Next, she sensed that Percy was unfaithful. It was his chambermaid this time, put detectives on his trail and turned over their findings to the vestryman, the Episcopal administrative body of his church. On a given Sunday, when Grant was scheduled to preach, they forced him to resign and took down his name. He was also required to pay back the $60,000, which wiped him out. And at that time, Juliet went about among the parishioners, collecting funds to help. Most of the press, except for the Times, was brutal. She said no church but one, Guthrie's St. Mark's in the Bowery, would let him preach. In any case, the words would not come anymore. As to the woman, she lived on, constantly under the surgeon's knife, constantly giving sumptuous dinner parties at which all she herself could eat was a little rice from a silver bowl, meanwhile assuring the guest that this was simply the best way of maintaining her slim and lovely shape. At the very last meeting Percy and Juliet ever had, it was in a drugstore, and the conversation languished. She asked herself how she could ever have loved him. With her final moments in the presence of Abdu'l-Baha, Juliet brings her diary to close. On December 5th, 1912, the ship sailed away, taking the master out of this hemisphere for always. Physically, he would be unobtainable now. That was the last sad day when he uttered his final spoken words to America, words in time to be read by millions, then heard by only a few. Florence Khanum remembered only 4 automobiles coming to the pier, she and Ali Khuli Khan being in the second one. These 2 believers, as well as Juliet, although they could not know it that day, would never look upon his earthly face again. Juliet tells how aboard the Celtic, more and more Baha'is crowded into the master's cabin and how they all went above to a spacious lounge. There, Ali Khuli Khan, translating, as the Star of the West reports, giving his Baha'i name, Ishtighal, the master paced up and down as he spoke. The earth is one home, and all mankind are the children of one Father. Therefore, we should live together in joy. God is loving and kind to all men, and yet they show the utmost enmity and hatred toward one another. You have no excuse to bring before God if you fail to live according to his command. For you are informed of the good pleasure of God. It is my hope that you may stir the body of existence like unto a spirit of life. Then the visitors slowly left the ship, and Juliet described Abdu'l-Baha's final look as he bade his immature children farewell. That loving anguish, those weary, prescient eyes gazing from his thin, ravaged face, are clearly seen in a photograph taken by Underwood at the last moment. And Life magazine, December 11, 1950, reproduces it, but with less clarity. The masters look from the rail of the ship at the upturned faces of the American Baha'is. Somehow, with Juliet, were able in after years to have 3 full-sized copies made from the old photographic plate, and only just in time, for it broke then as the messenger carried it across New York. They still return to haunt the mind, those vanished days and nights at Juliet's. I know the steps of those long gone still echo there. I know the powerful chant of Abdu'l-Baha, glad tidings, rebounds from wall to wall. Surely, all is still there as it was before, the spidery old chairs, the creaky, uncertain floor, canvases looming down in the dark, coals in the grate, Juliet in gold brocade and purple velvet, blonded fluffy hair, smiling blue eyes, a man on either side. You are not beautiful, her mother had told her. You are not handsome. You are lovely. There is a magic in Juliet's eyes, Dmitry Marianov said. All right. Now you get to see her a little bit, and you get to see Abdul Baha a little bit, and now you're going to see them again. Different angle, but this angle is very interesting. So first of all, I have to say, Susie is going to say hello to you because she's next to me and she's not been seen.
Hello, hello, Apa.
Aloha pa.
Papa.
Hello, Madam Zein.
Hi, Mom.
Hi. Okay,
All right, you
can I
guys.
go back?
So let's go back here. So I hope you bear with me because this I have to read. This I have to read. I must read. So while I was visiting New York in December 1950, this is now O.Z. Whitehead, another one, famous Baha'i in Ireland. Now you guys, you hear of the firesides in his name that are being done every week, I guess, in Ireland. Anyway, while I was visiting New York in December 1950, I went to a fireside meeting at Juliet Thompson's home at 48 West 10th Street. She had shared the apartment for many years with her friend Margaret Smith and their devoted servant Helen James. You've heard of them, of course. Mirza Ali Khuli Khan, his daughter Hamiden, and Marjorie Morton joined us before Juliet. I liked their faces. I wanted to get to know them. Then Juliet walked modestly into the room as if she did not expect anyone to notice her. She had wonderful, warm eyes and a delightful smile. She sat down in a comfortable chair near the fireplace. In a hoarse, attractive voice, she said to 2 or 3 of those present in turn, "Speak to us a little." She drew them out easily. Mirza Ali Khuli Khan gave a brilliant, fascinating analysis of a talk by the master. Marjorie Morton told a touching, humorous, and dramatic story of her first meeting with him. Then someone asked Juliet to describe his visit to the Museum of Natural History in New York. Without hesitation, she began her story. She said, one Saturday afternoon in July 1912, when the master was in New York, Mother and I decided to visit him. As we approached the house where he was staying, we saw him coming down the steps with some of the Persian friends. He greeted us warmly and said to Mother and me, "Come with us to the Museum of Natural History." Neither Mother nor I could understand why the master had decided to visit this museum on such a hot July afternoon. Mother and I just happily followed him and the Persian friends across the street to Central Park and into the park itself. With wary steps, the master walked ahead of the rest of us. Perspiration streamed down his cheek. When we were close to the museum, I saw that the many steps that led up to the entrance, I could not bear to see the master climb them. I looked for another way of getting into the museum, and I found a little door to the right-hand side of the steps. Between us and the door was a grass plot with a sign in the middle that said, "Keep off." In spite of this, I started to walk across the plot. Before I had reached the door, it opened. An old guard appeared from inside. He had gray hair and rather Semitic features. I stood where I was, but he walked up to me and said, not unkindly, "Don't you see the sign?" Probably many of you know this story, so I apologize in advance if you've heard of this, but since I have no way of knowing, I just go ahead with my story. I said, "Yes, but couldn't you make an exception just for this afternoon? We have with us a most distinguished guest who has come to this city with a message of world peace. The old guard looked at Abdul Baha with much interest and said, he reminds me of the prophets of Israel, of Isaiah and Daniel. I said to him, his name is Abdul Baha, the servant of God. We sometimes call him the master. The guard continued to look at Abdul Baha. Finally, he said, I feel sure that it would be all right for him to come through this door. The master came towards us with my mother and the Persian friends following him. The guard led us through the door up into the main hall of the museum. The master looked up at the huge whale suspended from the ceiling. He said with much amusement, 50 Jonas could have gotten into that whale. Then the guard showed us an exhibition of the old Mexican art. The master said, a great similarity between the art of Mexico and Egypt exists because at one time, what is now Egypt and Mexico were joined together. A Holocaust separated them. The master stayed only for a short time in the museum. He walked in front of us down the steps, through the side door and onto the grass where he sat down with his back against a tree. The old guard came up to me and said, do you think that your friend would mind if I went over and spoke to him? I told him that I was sure that he would be very glad if he did. The old guard walked over and stood beside Abdul Baha. Is it all right for me to sit here? The master asked. I'm sure that it is, said the guard. Don't you want to sit down here with me? Said the master. Oh no, that would never do, said the guard. But after you have rested for a while, would you like to come into the museum again and see some of the other exhibitions? The master replied, no, I have seen enough for today. Often, I get tired of this world and yearn to explore the other worlds of God. May I ask you this? If you could choose either to be in this world or in the next, which one would you take? After a moment of thought, the old guard answered, I think that I would stay in this world because I'm sure of it. Would you? Said the master. I'd take the next world. When one goes there, it will be like going to the second floor of a house. One will still know this world and yet be in the next. The old guard remarked, I had never thought of it that way, never thought of that before. The master said goodbye to the old guard warmly, but to my surprise, he did not ask him to a meeting where he might meet the friends. 2 or 3 days later, I went to see the old guard. He wasn't there anymore. A young guard had taken his place and had never heard of the old guard before. Much moved by this story, I asked Juliet to tell us another one. She looked at me and smiled with understanding and began again. She said, some of the Baha'is, including myself, decided to give the master a birthday party, and a few of them baked a cake. We took several taxis to the Bronx, with the master riding in the first one. As soon as his taxi had arrived there, the master got out and walked into the park ahead of the rest of us. A group of young boys gathered around him and started to laugh. 2 or 3 of them threw stones at him. With natural concern, many of the friends hurried towards the master, but he told them to stay away. The boys came closer to the master, jeered at him, and pulled at his clothes. The master did not become cross. He merely smiled at them radiantly, but the boys continued to behave as before. Then the master turned towards his friends, the friends. Bring me the cake, he said. No one had mentioned to him that we had brought a cake. Some of us said, but Abdul Baha, the cake is for your birthday. He repeated, bring me the cake. A friend uncovered a large sponge cake with white icing and gave it to the master. As soon as the boys had seen the cake, they began to come down and stared at the cake hungrily. The master took it in his hands and looked at the cake with pleasure. The boys were now standing quietly around him. Bring me a knife, said the master. A friend brought him a knife. The master counted the number of boys who were standing around him and then cut the cake into the same number of pieces. Each boy eagerly took a piece, ate it with relish, and then ran away happily.
That's so nice.
Juliet was born in Washington, D.C. in 1873, and from childhood, she showed talent for painting. Her parents sent her to the Corcoran Art School in Washington, but when she was almost 12, her father died. He left his family little money. Fortunately, Juliet was already able to sell her portraits in pastel. By the time she was 16, although she had not yet completed her training, she had gained a fine reputation for her work. So, now the next paragraph is the one I don't like to read, because I cannot read it with normal face, because it's a very sentimental paragraph. You know, I hope I can read it, go through it. I have no choice. So let's see if we can stop the tears here. One afternoon, when I was alone with Juliet, I asked her how she had heard about the Baha'i faith. She said, when I was a young girl living in New York, I became seriously ill, seriously sick with diphtheria, she said. One evening, see, it starts here now. One evening, while I was lying in bed, I heard the doctor say, to mother from the next room, Juliet is dying. When I went to sleep that night, I did not expect to wake up again. I had a dream and in it I saw a most wonderful looking man. He said to me with complete assurance, "You will get well." By the next morning, my fever had gone away. In 2 or 3 days, I had almost I know I was going to get to that point. In 2 or 3 days, I had almost recovered. I did not know who this man was, nor did I know how to find out. Several years later, after this experience, I went to study art at the Sorbonne in Paris. While I was there, I saw a photograph that I knew was of him. Someone told me, he's Abdul Baha, the servant of God. I became a believer in 1901. Julie did not say more to me about her conversion, but others have recorded that in 1901, Alice Barney, the mother of Laura Clifford Barney, generously invited Juliet to come to Paris with her mother and brother and study art there. In fact, in that city, Juliet became close to May Bowles, the first Baha'i who lived in Europe, Lua Getzinger, the mother teacher of the West, Thomas Breckwell, the first English believer, Hippolyte Dreyfus Barney, the first French believer, who adopted the surname of his wife Laura, and the great teacher Mirza Abul Fadl from Persia, whom the master had sent to France. Deep study with Mirza Abul Fazl and Mary Bowles greatly helped to confirm Juliet in the faith, and she became one of the distinguished groups of Baha'is just mentioned. After she had finished her studies at the Sorbonne, Juliet returned to New York with her mother and brother. Service to the cause of God now became the major aim of her life. Possessed with rare spiritual attraction, she taught the faith with much love to all those who seemed to be to her seekers of truth. Many have recorded that the regular meetings at her studio brought great happiness to countless people who attended there. Ever since recognizing the station of Baha'u'llah, Juliet had longed to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and met the Master. In 1909, her precious opportunity came to do this with two close friends, Edward and Carrie Kinney, their two sons, Howard and Sanford, and Alice Bede. From 2nd July 1909, 2 days after Juliet first met the Master in Akka, until 5th December 1912, the day of his sailing from New York City, and the last time that she met him in his physical world, she wrote a vivid and thrilling diary of her personal encounters with him and what she saw him do. Those are just 3 years. Just 3 years. Feels like forever. During her visit at the house of Abud in Akka, she wrote, "Our Lord called Carrie, Alice, and me separately to his room and gave us the priceless privilege of seeing him dictate tablets. I sat on the divan, my eyes upon his white-robed figure. I could scarcely raise them to his face as he paced up and down that small room with his strong tread. Never had the room seemed so small. Never had he appeared so mighty. A lion in a cage? Ah, no. That room contained him. Why, as I felt that great dominant force, that energy of God, I knew that the earth itself could not contain him, nor yet the universe. No. While the body, charged with a power I have seen in no human being, restless with the force that so animated it, strode up and down in that tiny room, pausing sometimes before the window below which the sea beat against the double seawall. I knew that the spirit was free as the essence itself, brooding over regions far distant, looking deep into hearts at the uttermost ends of the earth, consoling their secret sorrows, answering the whispers of far-off minds. Once in that walk back and forth, he would give me a look, grave glance. Once he smiled at me." During a visit with him a little over 2 years later, in August 1911, at the Hotel du Parc Tonon on Lake Geneva, she wrote, "I said to myself as I looked on that celestial radiance, if he never gave me so much as a word, if he never glanced my way just to see that sweetness shining before me, I would follow him on my knees, crawling behind him in the dust forever." On 5th Avenue and 10th Street in New York, just half a block from the house where Juliet and her mother lived, stands the Church of the Ascension, so called because of the beautiful and famous painting of the Ascension of Jesus Christ that hangs on the wall above the altar. Before she became a Baha'i, and for many years afterwards, Juliet often attended this church. Juliet once said to me, "I was very much in love with the rector, Dr. Percy Grant, and wanted to marry him. Of course, she earnestly hoped, that often prayed, that he would become a Baha'i." On 11th April 1912, the Master arrived in New York, thanks to Juliet's suggestion. Dr. Grant asked him to address the congregation on the following Sunday morning, according to the notes of the Congregation of Universal Peace. He started his talk by saying, in his scriptural lesson this morning, the Reverend Doctor read a verse from the Epistle of St. Paul to the Corinthians. "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." With clarity and force, the Master explained what Baha'u'llah had come to do and his relationship to Jesus Christ. Juliet continued, at the end of the master's talk, Percy asked the choir to sing Jesus Christ is risen today. I hurried into the vestry and waited impatiently for Percy to appear. When he did, the suspense became unbearable. Juliet, he said, I did it all for you. My heart sank. I was almost sure that I could never marry him. He did not come into the faith. The Bowery Mission in New York was a place of refuge for poor derelicts who often slept on park benches or doorsteps. Her mother had forbidden Juliet to give the message there in February 1912. For the first time in her life, she deceived her mother. Accompanied by a close friend, Sylvia Gannett, Juliet went there and gave a talk. When she had finished speaking, Dr. Halimont said, we have heard from Miss Juliet Thompson that Abdul Baha will be here in April. How many of you would like to invite him to speak at the mission? The whole 300 rose to their feet. On his acceptance of this invitation, the master gave Juliet a 1,000-franc note to change into American quarters and asked her to meet him on the following evening at the mission with these quarters in a bag. She and Edward Gessinger, both carrying a huge bag of quarters, arrived there promptly and sat down with the other believers on the platform behind him. Although Juliet felt unworthy to introduce the master, she obeyed Dr. Halimont and did so. She obeyed Dr. Halimont and did so. In a most moving and compassionate address, the master assured these broken men that the mercies and bounties of God were always with them. At the end of the service, the master and those who had come with him walked down the aisle together to the main door. When they had reached it, the master turned to Juliet and Edward and asked them to hold open their bags of silver and stand on either side of him. Juliet recorded, then down the aisle streamed the sodden and grimy procession, 300 men in single file, broken forms, blurred faces into each palm. As the master clasped it, he pressed his little gift of silver, just as a symbol and the price of a bed. Not a man was shelterless that night, and many, many I could see found a shelter in his heart. When Juliet was 10 years old, she began to dream and pray that someday she would be able to paint the Christ and make him look not just sweet and ineffectual like some artists had done, but like the King of men. As soon as she had met the master, she gave up all hope of doing this. She felt that it would be impossible. In the city of Washington, one evening, late in April, the master invited Juliet to paint him. He promised to give her 3 half hours. On June 1st, at his apartment in New York City, he posed for her. For the first time, Juliet has described the occasion. The master was seated in a dark corner, his black abba melting into the background, and again I saw him as the face of God, and quailed. How could I paint the face of God? I want you, he said, to paint my servitude to God. Oh, my Lord, I cried. Only the Holy Spirit could paint your servitude to God. No human hand could do that. Pray for me, or am I lost? I implore you, inspire me. I will pray, he answered, and as you are doing this only for the sake of God, you will be inspired. And then something amazing happened. All fear fell away from me, and it was as though someone else saw through my eyes, worked through my hand. All the points of all the planes in that matchless face were so clear to me that my hand couldn't put them down quickly enough, couldn't keep pace with the clarity of my vision. I painted in ecstasy, free as I had never been before. Although the master gave Juliet twice the sittings that he had promised her, she actually finished his portrait in 3. Juliet was always with the master whenever it was possible for him to see her. On 15th November 1912, less than a month before his departure from the United States, he gave a most powerful and comprehensive talk in her house. He said that he would speak on the distinctive characteristics of the manifestation of Baha'u'llah and prove that from every standpoint his cause is distinguished from all others. The great pain that Juliet felt on the morning of his departure from New York only became intensified when he could not assure her that she would again attain his physical presence. In June 1916, the master revealed the tablet for Juliet, and I will read the tablet for you, it's very short. It says, "To the maidservant of God, Miss Juliet Thompson, upon her be greeting and praise." Just imagine receiving a tablet from Abdul Baha. "O thou beloved daughter of the kingdom. Thy letter was received. It contained the most great glad tidings, that is, praise be to God in New York. The divine believers are united and agreed. From my heart, there is no greater happiness than the unity and concord of the friends, the progress of the world of humanity, and the illumination of the hearts and lives of the people are realized through unity and agreement and the promotion of the word of God. Difference destroys the foundation of the divine edifice, causing coldness among the souls and the lethargy of all the active members. I hope that day by day, this bounty may become more revealed in New York. Truly I say, if the believers of God become united together with heart and soul, in a short while they will shine forth like unto the sun. They will obtain joy and happiness, the splendor of which will be cast upon all the regions of America. Like all deeply spiritual people, Juliet found even the thought of war abhorrent. When the First World War dragged on in Europe, and she realized that the United States was gradually coming closer to a direct involvement, she spoke out against it. Only the absence of the master's permission kept her from appealing to President Wilson personally. In a tablet revealed after the war on 30 December 1918, the master advised her, "Do ye not refer regarding any matter in these days to the President of the Republic?" Juliet once said to me, "I was anxious to teach the faith in prisons. The master did not encourage me to do this. He said that I should work hard in my profession and give my free time to the cause." A tablet from the master, which Shaki Effendi translated on 4th of April 1919, included the following counsel: "O thou Juliet, endeavor in thy profession that thou mayest secure comfort for thy respected mother." Can I get a glass of water, Shaki? Although Juliet often wrote to the master and received from him tablets that clearly showed his deep love for her and his appreciation for services, she was not able to visit him again. In 1926, about 5 years after his passing, she next made the pilgrimage and shared with her attractive young companion, Mary Maxwell, the priceless privilege of meeting the guardian, Shorty Effendi. During her first pilgrimage to the Holy Land, Juliet had been drawn to walk down a little-known path that led to a small dome-shaped house. She was thrilled to learn that Mary of Magdala was said to have lived there where this house stood. The master told Juliet the true story of this Mary, and in the late 1930s, Juliet wrote a most moving book about her entitled I, Mary Magdalene. While Mary was living happily with her only lover, the Gentile Novatus, general of the Roman legions in Judea, half-brother of Rome's philosopher Seneca, John of Capernaum brought her word that he had seen the Messiah and urged her to come and see him. Although at first, her first meeting with Jesus, she was not sure if he were indeed Messiah or some false prophet to be forgot, she became impatient to see him again. Excuse me. On her second visit to Jesus, she found his teachings gloomy and felt that they could only offer her trouble. What he said also implied that her relationship with Novatus was adulterous. She could not accept his judgment as correct. With no intention of going to see Jesus again, she returned to her lover to enjoy for a while unclouded human happiness. She shut out thoughts of Jesus when they came. Soon, however, vivid dreams of him greatly troubled her. Again, she was filled with passionate desire to see him. During a third visit, she passed from doubt and to certainty, and without knowing why, she recognized her Lord immediately afterwards. She met with him alone. Juliet recounted this beautiful scene much as she did one of her own first visits with Abdul Baha in her journal. In a concluding passage, she wrote, I looked up to behold him, his hands raised in blessing above my head, his face uplifted in prayer, his eyes closed, his lips apart. Then he held my hand against his heart, and I, Mary Magdalene, heard the heart of Jesus beat. Juliet has vividly described the great suffering of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Mary's appeal to Claudia, the wife of Pilate, to save Jesus from crucifixion, the walk with him to Golgotha, the crucifixion itself, the meeting of Mary with her Lord, and his heavenly body near the threshold of his tomb, their meeting with John directly afterwards, to whom the Lord had also just spoken, and their efforts, at first unsuccessful, to convince the 10 other disciples that Jesus would be with them forever. This fascinating book is bound to attract more and more readers, written with a fine understanding of the eternal relationship between Mary Magdalene and her Lord, its beautiful account of her transformation from the gentle, appealing mistress of Novatus to the saintly disciple of Jesus Christ, will certainly encourage countless people to investigate the Word of God for this day. In 1939, Juliet wrote a stimulating essay on the Valley of Love, the second valley of 7 that the soul must pass through on its journey from self to God, as revealed by Baha'u'llah in the 7 valleys. In her penetrating analysis of the seeker's state in that valley, Juliet wrote, he has found the messenger, has seen for the first time powerfully reflected the unclouded beauty of God, and he has become like a newborn babe in a strange and glorious world. Besides the precious portrait that Juliet gave of the Master in her diaries, she wrote a remarkable essay about him entitled Abdul Baha, the Center of the Covenant. It is composed on a touching account of his life and a clear and forceful explanation of his station. I quote, when Abdul Baha ascended in 1921 to his original abode, plunging the Baha'i world into such grief as is only felt once in an age, when disciples mourned the Lord, his last will and testament came as a complete surprise, an inestimable bounty to his confused and desolate believers. For in it he appointed his own grandson, the beloved Shaykh Effendi, as the guardian of the Baha'i faith, and his successor as sole interpreter of the sacred books. So we found our faith still safeguarded from schism and dissensions, still led through a focal point of unerring guidance. With rare compassion, Juliet tried to help everyone whom she met, irrespective of their present character or past life. She gave much attention to the maladjusted and to moral failures. She did not judge people. When she heard that 2 people who had apparently betrayed their country were about to be executed, she said, I feel sorry for them. I'm praying for them. She once told a sincere believer who had a serious psychological problem that he was trying to overcome, when I reach the kingdom, I will speak to the Master about you. In obedience to the Master's words, she had grown to love all people. In spite of this, she did not naively think that even the believers always behave well, and also realized that they sometimes hurt each other. One afternoon, when I was sitting with Juliet, a young pianist who was an agnostic, joined us and attacked the faith violently. I became angry and could not understand why Juliet put up with him. She just smiled and looked at her friend with fondness and mixed with irritation. After he had left, I asked her, doesn't he disturb you? She said strongly, he doesn't affect me in the least. Juliet firmly believed that in the future, all of humanity would come into the Baha'i community. She realized, however, that in the world had so far veiled most people and that it might take them a long time to cast off these veils. Once I said to her, since I last saw you, I have found several young people who show interest in the faith. She firmly corrected me. You mean that the master brought them to you? During part of the Second World War, Juliet and Daisy Smith went as pioneer Baha'i teachers to Mexico. After the war was over, they spent some time teaching in New Orleans, Louisiana. My return to New York City from Los Angeles in June 1953, a few weeks after the start of the Guardians 10-year crusade, I went to see them. They now lived in an apartment next to the graveyard of St. Mark's in the Bowery, situated on the first floor. This long and narrow apartment had high ceilings and big windows. The bedrooms were on opposite sides of the living room. Comfortably seated in Juliet's bedroom, they greeted me warmly. Juliet said, we wrote to Shoki Effendi and asked him if we should pioneer. He answered that we should as soon as I'm well enough to go. In the meantime, the two ladies planned to hold fireside meetings in their new apartment. Much to their disappointment, Juliet's doctor advised them to wait until her health had improved. When I left for my pilgrimage in early January 1955, the two ladies still hoped that they would be able to pioneer. On the last night of my pilgrimage, at dinner, I said, Shoki Effendi, Juliet Thompson and Daisy Smith are most anxious to leave the city of the Covenant, according to your instructions, but Juliet's frail health keeps her in bed most of the time. With his perfect understanding, he said, tell them to get the best medical and aid possible for Juliet and not to worry. Say that I thank her for her past services. Soon after my return to New York, I went to see them and told them what the Guardian had advised. On the evening of 2nd December 1956, during a meeting of the Spiritual Assembly of New York, a telephone call came from Daisy informing us that Juliet was dead. The funeral took place in the following Saturday morning. About 150 Baha'is and a few people not in the faith attended the service. Bora Kavlin, at that time treasurer, the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States, and I were privileged to conduct it. Sir Kavlin read the Guardian, most moving message mixed with grief and joy. Deplore lost much love, greatly admired Juliet Thompson. Outstanding, exemplary handmaid of Abdul Baha, over half a century, record manifold meritorious services embracing concluding years, heroic, opening decades, formative age, Baha'i dispensation, won her inviolable position. Glorious company, triumphant disciples, beloved master of her kingdom. Advise, hold memorial gatherings, matrical askar, pay befitting tribute, imperishable memory, one so holy consecrated faith Baha'u'llah, fired such consuming devotion, center his covenant, Zein Shoki. When the burial service in the afternoon began, the sky was dark, it was raining a little, the branches of the pine trees shook in the wind. As I started to read the following passage from prayer for the departed, the sky brightened and the sun came out. It shone on Juliet's coffin and her grave. O thou, who art the Lord of all men, grant then, O my Lord, my God, that thy servant may consort with the chosen ones, thy saints and thy messengers, in heavenly places that the pen cannot tell nor the tongue recount. Juliet once described to me the death of a believer in these words: he has taken a little trip to the kingdom. In the upper kingdom, could she not be helping many of us? Maybe the master has asked her to wander spiritually through this earthly planet in search of all those who are looking for the spirit of truth. So, dear friends, this is two short, kind, moving biographies of Juliet Thompson. But next week, we are going to read what she says, just little glimpses of those 3 years mostly in Akka, but whenever, maybe even in the US, of what she said Abdul Baha did or say, how she looked at him, what he said to her. And it's just a love story. It's really a love story. Very incredible. So you see the value of Baha'is writing journals. I mean, when you don't write journals, it's very difficult for people that come after you to remember the details that only you know. So this is the case for all Baha'is, be it by pioneers or not pioneers. I mean, some people just don't write. People should write. So that's one lesson we're picking up tonight is all of you out there, write. Right now that the memory is fresh. Some of us, maybe it's a bit late to write, but anyway. So thank you all for being there.